Today I'm going to tell you the story of a young woman who escaped a terrible fate in the snowy Montana wilderness of 1887. Elizabeth Harrington never expected to find salvation in the cabin of a reclusive mountain trapper when she fled the prestigious finishing school that was hiding dark secrets. But what happened next left everyone in shock. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. Caleb Blackwood squinted through the swirling snow, the bitter Montana wind cutting through his layers of furs. The blizzard had descended without warning, transforming the familiar forest into an alien landscape of white. He'd nearly missed the tracks, small, irregular depressions in the snow that no animal would make. Human footprints, and recent ones at that. In 15 years of trapping in these mountains, Caleb had developed instincts that kept him alive where others perished. Those instincts told him to turn back now, to return to his cabin before the storm worsened. Nothing good ever came from strangers in these mountains, especially not in the dead of winter. Yet something about those tracks troubled him. They were small, a child perhaps or a woman, and the stride was uneven, suggesting injury or exhaustion. Whoever had passed this way was ill-prepared for the mountains in January. Cursing under his breath, Caleb adjusted his rifle and followed the trail. The tracks meandered, sometimes doubling back as if their maker was disoriented. Caleb quickened his pace. No one survived a night exposed in this weather. He'd covered less than a mile when he saw her, a dark figure stumbling through the snow ahead, barely visible through the thickening storm. As he drew closer, his suspicions were confirmed. A woman, dressed only in what appeared to be a nightgown, with some sort of shawl clutched around her shoulders. "Hello," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. The figure froze, then turned. For a moment, they stared at each other across 20 yards of driving snow. Then, surprisingly, she ran toward him. "Please," she gasped as she reached him, her voice raw from the cold. "Please help me." Up close, Caleb could see she was young, no more than 20, with dark hair that whipped wildly in the wind. Her face, though red from cold, held a refined beauty that seemed out of place in the wilderness. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, amber-colored and filled with naked terror. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" he demanded, shrugging off his outer coat and wrapping it around her shoulders in one fluid motion. She clutched at the coat with trembling hands. "Running." Her teeth chattered violently. "They'll be looking for me." "Who?" "Mrs. Thornwood, her men." She glanced over her shoulder fearfully. "I can't go back there. I won't." Caleb scanned the forest behind her. If someone was pursuing this woman, the blizzard had covered their tracks as effectively as it was now erasing his own. "There's no one else out in this storm," he said. "Not if they value their lives. My cabin's half a mile back. Can you walk?" She nodded, but as she took a step, her legs buckled. Caleb caught her before she fell, noting with alarm that her feet were bare, raw, and bleeding from exposure. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. She was worryingly light, and despite the coat he'd given her, she shivered uncontrollably against his chest. "I don't even know your name," he said, setting off in the direction of his cabin. "Elizabeth?" she managed through chattering teeth. "Elizabeth Harrington." "Caleb Blackwood." He adjusted his grip, shielding her face from the worst of the wind with his body. "Hold tight, Miss Harrington. Storm's getting worse." By the time they reached his cabin, the blizzard had transformed into a white wall of driving snow. Caleb shouldered open the door, ducking inside with Elizabeth still cradled in his arms. The contrast between the howling storm and the cabin's quiet dimness was jarring. He set her down gently on his single chair before moving quickly to stoke the dying fire. As warmth gradually filled the small space, he turned back to his unexpected guest. Elizabeth Harrington was a concerning sight. Her nightgown, which he could now see was of fine quality, if completely inappropriate for winter, was torn and stained. Dark bruises circled both wrists. Her feet were in terrible condition, and her lips held a bluish tinge that spoke of advancing hypothermia. "Those feet need tending," he said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact as he retrieved his medical supplies from a shelf. He'd learned long ago that efficiency trumped gentleness in survival situations. She nodded silently, watching him with wary eyes as he knelt before her with a basin of water he'd warmed on the stove. "This will hurt," he warned, before carefully beginning to clean her feet. Elizabeth hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. Caleb worked methodically, removing embedded splinters and small stones before applying a salve of his own making and wrapping each foot in clean cloth. "Thank you," she whispered when he'd finished. He nodded, standing to put a kettle on the stove. You need warming from the inside too. Tea will help. While the water heated, Caleb retrieved a worn but clean shirt and pair of wool socks from his trunk. Change into these, he said, handing them to her. I'll step outside. No! The panic in her voice stopped him. Please don't go out there. What if they're coming? Caleb frowned. No one's coming in this storm, Miss Harrington, but I'll just turn my back if you prefer. He faced the wall while she changed, using the time to assess his situation. He'd lived alone since returning from the war, deliberately choosing isolation over the complications of human company. Now he'd invited those complications directly into his home. I'm decent, Elizabeth said after a moment. She'd rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, which hung nearly to her knees, with her dark hair falling in tangles around her face and her bare legs disappearing into his oversized wool socks. She looked absurdly young and vulnerable. Caleb poured tea into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. Drink, then we talk. She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. Now, he said, settling onto his bed across from her. Explain why I found a young lady from, he noted her refined accent. Back east, I'm guessing, running barefoot through a blizzard in the middle of nowhere, Montana. Elizabeth stared into her cup. I escaped from Thornwood Manor. It's a finishing school for young ladies about 10 miles east of here. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Never heard of it. It's remote. Deliberately so. A bitter smile touched her lips. Parents send their daughters there to learn proper etiquette, far from distractions. And you were running from this school? Why? Elizabeth's hands tightened around her cup. Because it's not a school. Not really. She drew a shaky breath. Mrs. Thornwood. She selects girls from wealthy families, preferably those without mothers. She promises to turn us into proper ladies, ready for advantageous marriages. Our fathers pay handsomely for the privilege. She looked up, meeting Caleb's eyes directly. But once we're there, isolated from anyone who might help us, the truth emerges. We're being groomed for marriage, yes, but not to respectable gentlemen. Mrs. Thornwood has arrangements with men, criminals, most of them, who pay her for wives they could never attract through normal means. Caleb frowned. You're saying this woman sells young ladies to criminals? Elizabeth nodded. 3 girls have been graduated since I arrived 6 months ago. Each one married within a week to men I'd seen meeting privately with Mrs. Thornwood, men who looked at us like we were livestock. A cold anger settled in Caleb's chest. He'd seen the worst of humanity during the war, but predation on the innocent still kindled his rage. My turn was coming, Elizabeth continued quietly. A man named Clayton Reed arrived yesterday. I overheard Mrs. Thornwood telling him I would suit his requirements perfectly. The price was being negotiated. She shuddered. I couldn't let that happen. So when everyone was asleep, I ran. In a nightgown? In January? Caleb couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. I didn't have time to plan, she replied defensively. One of the other girls discovered I was missing and raised the alarm. I took what I could grab and fled. Caleb stood, moving to the window. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. The glass frosted over completely. No one's traveling in this, he said, as much to himself as to her. You're safe for tonight at least. And tomorrow? The fear had returned to Elizabeth's voice. Caleb turned back to her. Tomorrow we see if the storm's cleared. If it has, I'll take you to the nearest town, Pine Ridge. It's a 2-day journey in good weather. And if the storm hasn't cleared, then we wait until it does. Elizabeth set down her cup. Mr. Blackwood, what if they come looking for me here? No one knows about this cabin except a few trappers who won't be in these mountains until spring, he assured her. And even if they somehow found it, they'd have to get through me first. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to comfort her. Caleb had spent 15 years avoiding other people's problems. Yet here he was, making promises to a woman he'd just met. You should rest, he said, gesturing to his bed. Take it. I'll sleep by the fire. Elizabeth hesitated. I've imposed enough already. You have, he agreed bluntly. But you're here now, and you need proper rest to heal those feet. The bed's yours. As she settled under the furs, Caleb added wood to the fire and checked that his rifle was loaded and within easy reach. The storm would keep any pursuers at bay tonight, but he wasn't taking chances. Mr. Blackwood? Elizabeth's voice came softly from the bed. Caleb, he corrected. No point in formalities in a one-room cabin. Caleb, she amended. Thank you, for finding me, for believing me, he grunted in acknowledgement, settling himself on the floor with his back against the wall. I don't want to go back there, she whispered, her voice catching. I can't. No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go, Caleb replied. Not while I'm breathing. Now get some sleep. As Elizabeth's breathing eventually deepened into slumber, Caleb stared into the fire, wondering what kind of storm, beyond the one howling outside, he'd just invited into his carefully isolated life. Caleb woke with dawn's first light filtering through the cabin's single window. The blizzard had passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He rose stiffly, adding wood to the embers before checking on his guest. Elizabeth slept deeply, her dark hair stark against the pale furs. In sleep, the fear had left her face, revealing a youthful innocence at odds with her harrowing story. The bruises on her wrists stood out vividly, confirming at least part of her tale. Moving quietly, Caleb pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The world had transformed overnight into a pristine white landscape, the snow nearly waist-deep in places. He trudged around the cabin, scanning the surroundings. No tracks marred the perfect white blanket. They were alone for now. Back inside, he found Elizabeth awake, sitting up in bed with furs pulled around her shoulders. The storm's passed, he informed her, stamping snow from his boots. Can we leave for Pine Ridge today? Hope brightened her eyes. Caleb shook his head. Snow's too deep. Need to wait for it to settle or we'll exhaust ourselves before covering a mile. He moved to the stove. We're safe here for now. No tracks anywhere. Elizabeth's shoulders slumped. How long must we wait? 2 days, maybe 3. He set coffee to boil. Those feet need healing anyway before you attempt any journey. She pushed back the furs and examined her bandaged feet with a frown. I've never felt so helpless. You survived a blizzard in a nightgown, Caleb observed, slicing salt pork into a pan. I wouldn't call that helpless. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. I suppose not. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence. Afterward, Caleb rebandaged Elizabeth's feet, noting with satisfaction that infection hadn't set in. Tell me about Thornwood Manor, he said as he worked. How many people? Layout? Defenses? Elizabeth described a large stone house, originally built by a mining baron before the silver played out, set in a clearing surrounded by forest, with a view of the valley below. 12 students currently, she continued. Mrs. Thornwood, 3 female teachers who are really more like guards, and 3 men who handle security and discipline. Her voice faltered on the last word. These men, they armed? She nodded. Revolvers, and 1 has a shotgun. Caleb absorbed this information silently. 6 adults, potentially all armed, against 1 mountain man and an injured young woman. Not favorable odds. This Mrs. Thornwood, he asked. What's her story? She claims to be a widow of breeding fallen on hard times, Elizabeth replied. But I overheard things. I think her husband was hanged. Something about confidence schemes back east. Caleb grunted. Explains why she's hidden away in Montana. The day passed quietly. Elizabeth rested while Caleb performed his daily tasks, checking trap lines nearest the cabin, chopping more wood, preparing food. By evening, a comfortable routine had established itself between them. Do you have family waiting for you somewhere? Elizabeth asked as they shared a rabbit stew. Caleb shook his head. Parents died before the war. No siblings. The war? You fought for the Union? Pennsylvania 83rd, he confirmed. You seem certain of that. A slight smile. No Confederate soldier would have retreated this far north. Fair point. He studied her over his bowl. And you, besides your father? Mother died of influenza when I was 16. No siblings either. Her spoon traced patterns in her stew. Father remarried last year. My stepmother suggested Thornwood Manor, said a finishing school would make me more marriageable. She knew what the place really was. Elizabeth's expression darkened. I don't know. Perhaps she simply wanted me gone. Caleb recognized the pain beneath her words. And your father agreed? Father's a banker in Boston. He means well, but business always comes first. When Amanda, my stepmother, insisted, he saw no reason to refuse. Her voice turned bitter. He believes I'm receiving an excellent education. You've had no contact with him since arriving? Letters are written under supervision. Everything read, censored. Elizabeth set down her spoon. I tried coding messages into my first few letters. After Mrs. Thornwood discovered this, I wasn't allowed to write at all. She forges our correspondence now. Caleb considered this. So your father has no idea you're missing? Not until spring when he's scheduled to visit. Elizabeth's face crumpled slightly. By then, I'd have been married and gone. Anger stirred in Caleb's chest, the same righteous rage that had driven him to enlist decades ago. Some injustices couldn't be ignored, even by a man who'd sworn off human entanglements. We'll get word to him, he promised. From Pine Ridge. Telegraph office there. Elizabeth nodded, but worry still lined her face. What if they find us before then? They won't. You can't know that. I know these mountains better than any man alive, Caleb stated flatly. If anyone approaches within a mile of this cabin, I'll know. The confidence in his voice seemed to reassure her, though Caleb knew the reality was more complicated. In deep snow, even his woodcraft had limitations. Night fell swiftly as it always did in winter. Caleb added logs to the fire while Elizabeth fashioned a pallet for herself on the floor. Take the bed, Caleb insisted. Your feet are healing nicely thanks to your care, she interrupted. But I won't displace you from your bed another night. Her chin lifted in that stubborn way he was beginning to recognize. He'd seen it in young lieutenants who wouldn't back down despite impossible odds, usually before they got themselves killed. Suit yourself, he conceded, too tired to argue. But the offer stands. He had just settled onto his bed when Elizabeth spoke again from her place near the fire. Caleb, what will happen when we reach Pine Ridge? He turned to look at her face gilded by firelight. We'll send word to your father. Have him come collect you. And if Mrs. Thornwood's men find us first? Caleb's hand moved to the rifle propped beside his bed. Then they'll regret it. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment. I've never seen anyone killed. I don't think I want to. Even them. The innocence of the statement struck Caleb with unexpected force. He'd seen hundreds of men die, had caused more deaths than he cared to remember. That this young woman could maintain such moral clarity after what she'd endured spoke to a strength of character he hadn't anticipated. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, he said finally. Sleep now. Tomorrow we'll see if the snow's settled enough to travel. Long after Elizabeth's breathing had deepened into sleep, Caleb lay awake, his mind turning over contingency plans. The smart choice, the survival choice, would be to point her toward Pine Ridge once her feet healed, then disappear back into his mountains. But the thought of abandoning her to face potential pursuers alone sat like lead in his stomach. Some burdens, once shouldered, couldn't be set down so easily. Outside, an owl called into the night. Caleb listened for an answering call, but none came. Just a solitary hunter, like himself, navigating a world where most things were either predator or prey. The question that troubled his sleep was which category Elizabeth Harrington fell into, and which one he did. On the third morning, Caleb deemed the snow settled enough for travel. They prepared quietly, Elizabeth now dressed in clothes he'd fashioned from his spares, trousers rolled up and cinched with rope, a flannel shirt beneath his smallest coat, and moccasins for her healing feet. Not exactly Boston fashion, she commented, attempting a smile as she examined her reflection in Caleb's small shaving mirror. Better than freezing, Caleb replied, packing only essentials, food, ammunition, medical supplies. Fashion doesn't matter much out here. They set out at dawn, Caleb breaking trail while Elizabeth followed. Her feet, though healing, weren't accustomed to such travel, and they stopped frequently for her to rest. By midday, they'd covered only 3 miles. How far to Pine Ridge? Elizabeth asked during their brief lunch of jerky and hard biscuits. 20 miles the way we have to travel. 2 days at this pace. Caleb passed her his canteen. Drink. Easy to forget thirst in cold. Elizabeth nodded, taking a careful sip. I'm slowing us down. We'll make it, Caleb said simply. No use pushing so hard you can't finish the journey. They were making decent progress when Caleb suddenly halted, crouching to examine something in the snow. Boot prints, he said grimly. Men's. At least 3 different sets. Elizabeth's face paled. Mrs. Thornwood's men? Can't say for certain. But they're heading toward my cabin. They're tracking us, she whispered, fear evident in her voice. Trying to, Caleb corrected. They're at least a day behind. If we're careful, they won't find our trail. They changed course, taking a less obvious route that utilized rocky areas where they'd leave no tracks. Caleb remained vigilant, frequently scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. Tell me about these men, he said as they carefully crossed a rocky slope. The ones from Thornwood Manor. Elizabeth's expression darkened. 3 of them. Former soldiers, I think. Their leader is called Garrett. He takes pleasure in punishment. She unconsciously touched the bruises on her wrists. The other 2 follow his orders without question. And they're all armed? She nodded. Revolvers. Garrett carries a shotgun as well. Caleb absorbed this information silently. 6 adults, potentially all armed, against 1 mountain man and an injured young woman. Not favorable odds if it came to a confrontation. As twilight deepened, Caleb found a sheltered hollow protected by dense pines and constructed a small lean-to. He built a nearly smokeless fire just large enough to provide warmth against the frigid night. "Won't they see it?" Elizabeth asked, huddling close to the modest flames. "Not if we keep it small. These pines shield most of the light." He handed her a cup of heated coffee. Cold night ahead. They ate a spare meal in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Caleb showed Elizabeth how to arrange pine boughs beneath the lean-to for insulation from the frozen ground. As darkness descended, they settled side by side under shared furs, propriety forgotten in the face of survival's demands. "Will we reach Pine Ridge tomorrow?" Elizabeth asked softly. "Day after, if we push hard. Sheriff there will help contact your father. And you? What will you do after?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "Return to my cabin, I suppose." "Aren't you worried they'll come after you there? For revenge?" He shrugged. "Let them try." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "I don't understand you, Caleb. Why risk everything for a stranger? War taught me about standing by while others suffer. I did too much of that." He paused. "Some debts can't be repaid directly. You were in the war? Which side?" "Pennsylvania 83rd Union." Elizabeth nodded. "What happened? After the war, I mean." Caleb stared up at the stars barely visible through the pine branches. "Came west. Couldn't stomach cities anymore. Too many people. Too much noise." "And you've been alone ever since?" "Prefer it that way," he said, though something in his tone suggested it wasn't entirely true. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being different, for helping me." Caleb merely grunted in acknowledgement, uncomfortable with gratitude. Long after Elizabeth's breathing deepened into sleep, Caleb remained awake, alert to every sound in the forest around them. The tracks they'd discovered troubled him more than he'd let on. Men willing to pursue a girl through mountain wilderness in January weren't likely to give up easily. Dawn was still hours away when a sound jerked Caleb fully alert. The distant whinny of a horse, carried on the still night air. He slipped from beneath the firs, careful not to wake Elizabeth, and moved silently to the edge of their camp. The moon had risen, casting blue-white light across the snow. In that ghostly illumination, Caleb scanned the forest below. There, perhaps half a mile distant, a flicker of movement. He strained his eyes, making out dark shapes moving between trees. Men on horseback, following the very route he and Elizabeth had abandoned hours earlier. Caleb returned to the lean-to, gently shaking Elizabeth awake. "We need to move," he whispered. "Now." She came awake instantly, reading the urgency in his face. "They've found us?" "Not yet, but they're close." They packed swiftly and moved uphill where horses would struggle to follow. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, though Elizabeth stumbled occasionally on hidden obstacles beneath the snow. "Stay in my footprints," Caleb instructed. "Less chance of leaving clear tracks." They'd been traveling for perhaps an hour when the distant report of a rifle shattered the night silence. Elizabeth clutched Caleb's arm. "Signal shot," he explained grimly. "They've found our campsite." A second shot answered from another direction. "They're coordinating, surrounding the area. What do we do?" "There's a mining trail about 2 miles southeast, too narrow for horses. If we reach it first, we might beat them to Pine Ridge." They abandoned stealth for speed. The eastern sky was lightening when they heard men's voices. Too close. Caleb made a swift decision. "There's a ridgeline ahead. Once across, you'll see a valley with a creek. Follow it downstream to the mining trail. What about you?" "I'm going to lead them away, buy you time." "No!" Elizabeth's eyes widened. "They'll kill you. They won't catch me. These are my mountains, not theirs. I can't leave you. You can and will." He pressed his revolver into her hand. 6 shots. "Use them only if necessary." "How will I find you again?" The question surprised him. "You won't. Once you're safe." "No," she interrupted fiercely. "I'm not leaving you permanently. Tell me where to find you after." Caleb studied her face. seeing determination there that matched his own. Granite Falls, north of Pine Ridge. Trapper's Lodge there. Ask for old Mike. Elizabeth stood on tiptoe and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Be careful, Caleb Blackwood. Then she was gone, moving toward the ridgeline. Caleb watched until she disappeared, then turned to face the approaching hunters. He would lead them on a chase they wouldn't soon forget. Elizabeth stumbled down the steep slope toward the valley below, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to not abandon Caleb to face those men alone. But she forced herself forward, knowing that splitting up gave them both a better chance at survival. The creek appeared through the trees just as Caleb had described, a ribbon of dark water against white snow, partially frozen but still flowing in the center. She followed it downstream, her breath coming in white puffs as morning light strengthened around her. A distant gunshot made her freeze, then another, and a third. Each report echoed off the mountainsides, making it impossible to tell how far away they were or who had fired. Elizabeth clutched Caleb's revolver, her hand trembling. Please be safe, she whispered, then continued her descent. The mining trail was exactly where Caleb had said it would be. A narrow path cut into the mountainside, barely wide enough for a single mule. It showed signs of long abandonment, with fallen rocks and debris partially blocking sections, but it offered a clear route southeastward toward Pine Ridge. Elizabeth followed it as quickly as her exhausted body would allow. Every sound, a branch cracking under the weight of snow, the cry of a distant hawk, made her start and reach for the revolver. By midday, her legs were leaden, and her healing feet burned with pain inside the moccasins. She rested briefly in the shelter of an overhanging rock, eating a small portion of the jerky Caleb had pressed into her hand before they'd separated. As she chewed the tough meat, her mind wandered back to Boston, to the comfortable life she'd known there. How distant it all seemed now, the elegant parties, the social machinations, the endless concern about appearances. None of it had prepared her for this, for survival in wilderness, for the raw struggle against cold and hunger and pursuit. Yet here she was, still alive, still moving forward. There was a strange pride in that realization. A sudden noise, the distinctive sound of a footstep crunching in snow, snapped her back to full alertness. Someone was approaching from around the bend in the trail. Elizabeth drew the revolver with shaking hands, pressing herself against the rock face. The footsteps grew closer. She held her breath, finger hovering near the trigger. A man rounded the corner, tall, bearded, but not Caleb. He wore a fur-lined coat and carried a rifle. Behind him, another man appeared. Well now, the first man said, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. What do we have here? Elizabeth recognized him instantly. Garrett, Thornwood Manor's head of security. The second man was one of his subordinates, a wiry fellow the girls had called Rat for his pointed features and furtive manner. She raised the revolver, trying to steady her aim. Stay back. Garrett smiled, showing yellowed teeth. Miss Harrington, Mrs. Thornwood is most concerned about you. Been searching these mountains for days. I'm not going back, Elizabeth declared, her voice stronger than she felt. Now, that's not your decision, is it? Garrett took a step forward. Your stepmother paid good money for your education, and Mr. Reed is still very interested in making you his wife. The mention of Reed, the man she'd been promised to, made Elizabeth's stomach turn. I said stay back. Garrett's smile disappeared. Put down that gun, girl. You haven't got the nerve to use it. I wouldn't bet on that, came a voice from behind Elizabeth. Caleb stepped out from the rocks above the trail, his rifle trained on Garrett. Blood streaked one side of his face, but his hands were steady. Relief flooded through Elizabeth, quickly followed by confusion. Caleb, how did you— Circled back, he replied, not taking his eyes off the two men. Figured they'd split up to cover more ground. These two took the obvious route. Garrett's hand had frozen halfway to his holster. This doesn't concern you, mountain man. The girl is property of Thornwood Manor until her education is complete. She's not property at all, Caleb countered, and her education seems just fine to me. There's a reward, Rat offered, his eyes darting between Caleb and Elizabeth. $500 for her safe return. Could be yours. Not interested. Caleb nodded toward their weapons. Drop them. Slowly. Instead, Garrett dove sideways as Rat drew his pistol. A shot rang out, not from Caleb's rifle or Rat's pistol, but from Elizabeth's revolver. Rat screamed, dropping his gun and clutching his shoulder. Garrett had rolled behind a boulder, drawing his own weapon. He fired twice, bullets splintering the rock near Caleb's head. "Get down!" Caleb shouted to Elizabeth, who had already pressed herself flat against the trail's inner wall. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Caleb worked his way from cover to cover, forcing Garrett to divide his attention. Elizabeth remained where she was, the revolver clutched in white-knuckled hands, watching as Rat writhed in pain on the ground. A movement caught her eye. Garrett was attempting to work his way around to flank Caleb. Without thinking, Elizabeth raised the revolver again and fired. The bullet missed, but it forced Garrett back into cover. "Enough!" Garrett shouted. "We just want the girl. Leave now and you live." "Not happening," Caleb called back. "She worth dying for, mountain man?" Caleb didn't answer, but Elizabeth saw him shifting position, working to get a clear shot. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the distant sound of voices and horses, approaching from the direction of Pine Ridge. "Sounds like company," Caleb remarked loudly enough for Garrett to hear. Garrett cursed. "Rat, get up. We're leaving." "Can't," gasped the wounded man. "She shot me good." "Then you're on your own." Garrett fired 2 more shots in Caleb's direction, then turned and scrambled back up the trail the way he had come. Caleb emerged from cover, rifle trained on Rat, who raised his uninjured arm in surrender. "Don't kill me," the man pleaded. "I was just following orders." "Seems to be a common excuse," Caleb muttered, then called to Elizabeth. "You all right?" She nodded, still processing what had just happened. "I shot him," she said, looking at Rat with a mixture of horror and pride. "Good shot, too," Caleb observed. "Saved us both a lot of trouble." The voices grew louder, and soon a group of men on horseback appeared around the bend. At their head rode a broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his coat. "That's far enough," the man called, raising a hand to halt his companions. "Identify yourselves." "Caleb Blackwood," Caleb responded. "This is Miss Elizabeth Harrington. We're headed to Pine Ridge." "Sheriff John Bannerman," the man replied, studying the scene before him. "Heard gunshots. Care to explain why there's a bleeding man at your feet?" "That," said Caleb, "is a long story." 3 days later, Elizabeth sat in Sheriff Bannerman's office, a telegram from her father in her hands. The terse message confirmed he was departing Boston immediately and would arrive within the week. "He believed me," she said, looking up at Caleb, who stood by the window. "About Mrs. Thornwood. About everything." "Evidence was pretty convincing," Caleb replied. Indeed it was. Garrett had been captured attempting to flee the area. Under Bannerman's questioning, he'd revealed enough about Thornwood Manor's operation to justify a raid. 6 young women had been freed, and Mrs. Thornwood herself now occupied a cell in Pine Ridge's small jail, awaiting federal marshals. "What will happen to them?" Elizabeth asked. "Mrs. Thornwood will hang, most likely," Sheriff Bannerman said from his desk. "Garrett, too. The others might get prison terms depending on their involvement." Elizabeth nodded, feeling no satisfaction at the news, only a hollow relief. "And you, Mr. Blackwood?" Bannerman asked. "Will you be returning to your cabin?" Caleb shrugged. "Eventually. Thought I might stay in town until Miss Harrington's father arrives. Make sure there are no more surprises." The sheriff smiled knowingly. "Generous of you." An awkward silence followed, broken when Bannerman excused himself to check on the prisoners. "You don't have to stay," Elizabeth said once they were alone. "I'm safe now." "I know." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "But I gave my word I'd see you safely to your father. I mean to keep it." Elizabeth studied him, this rough, solitary man who had risked everything for a stranger. The blood on his face from the gunfight had been cleaned away, revealing a new scar along his temple where a bullet had grazed him. One more mark to add to his collection. "What will you do after?" she asked. "Go back to trapping? Back to being alone?" "It's what I know," he replied simply. Elizabeth stood, moving to stand before him. "You could know something else. My father would give you any position you wanted in his company. In Boston." Caleb's expression softened. "I'm not made for cities, Elizabeth, or for boardrooms." "Then I'll stay here," she said impulsively. "In Montana." He actually laughed at that, a short, surprised sound. "And do what? You're a Boston society girl." "I'm the girl who survived Thornwood Manor," she corrected him. "The girl who shot a man to save your life. I'm not the same person who arrived in Montana 6 months ago." Caleb studied her face, seeing the determination there. "Your father would never allow it." "I'm 21, Elizabeth countered. "I don't need his permission." "Elizabeth." At least think about it, she interrupted. You don't have to decide now. After a moment, Caleb nodded. I'll think about it. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough for now. Elizabeth knew that some journeys couldn't be rushed, that some trails took time to navigate. But for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly alive, truly herself. Whatever path she chose next, she would walk it with open eyes and a stronger heart, knowing she had survived the wilderness and found, in the most unlikely place, someone worth caring for.